Hello there, everybody. Hi there. Welcome back to the Bedtime with Cousin Vinny series. And as you know, I'm critically acclaimed national author Cousin Vinny Agnello, dressed as the protagonist of The Devil's Glove in the second edition, which is what we have here tonight. We're reading about 180 pages of The Devil's Glove in 15-minute segments, and of course when you get done or any time, you can always call that number up there, 813-703-3618, and talk to me about getting yourself your own autographed personalized copy for a very discounted price. The email address is cousinvinny10@gmail.com. The Devil's Glove replica is behind me, and there's a picture of the new cover of the sequel to this book, The Devil's Glove, called The Revenge of the Manager, and that's over my left shoulder. Anyway, this is one of the great teases, 180 pages, and this is a huge favorite among the fans. They love this book, and let's not talk, let's read. Let me go on, and I don't normally dress as Billy Green, but he's showing up soon, so in the book. Yesterday we left you on page 122, and Eddie was going down to see why all the upperclassmen were checking out the bulletin board, and here we are. Eddie was unable to see the posted memo, so he tugged on one of the upperclassmen's shirt sleeves to get his attention. "What?" the upperclassman asked in annoyance. "What's it say?" Eddie inquisitively asked. The upperclassman stared down at Eddie, and a sadistic smile suddenly appeared upon his face. He then replied, "I do believe it says that all wimpy freshmen should have pink bellies." The upperclassman shouted his inflammatory words as loud as possible, making sure that all the other upperclassmen could hear him. The older boys quickly turned away from the memo to stare at Eddie, their mouths watering like a pack of hungry wolves. Eddie could see it in their eyes. The older boys would enjoy nothing more than abusing a lowly freshman on this boring afternoon, and unfortunately for him, he quickly realized that he was that, quote, lowly freshman. Bobby Jones, the older brother of one of his former Astros teammates, stepped forward out of the pack. "Hey, fellas, that's Linus." Bobby Jones laughed sadistically. "He thinks he's a hotshot. My brother played ball with this little obnoxious jerk back in Little League. He never goes anywhere without that Salvation Army glove of his." He added, "He's attached to it the same way as Linus was to his blanket. Since we're in school, why not conduct an experiment? Why don't we take that glove from him and see what happens?" Bobby Jones enticed. The older boys laughed loudly at Bobby Jones's remarks. The upperclassman who Eddie made the mistake of interrupting quickly shoved him and grabbed away his prize mitt, holding it in the air, way too high for him to retrieve. "Hey, look what I got. Everybody, it's the Salvation Army mitt!" The upperclassman announced while laughing hysterically. He immediately used his free arm to fend off Eddie's relentless advances. "It's mine! Give it back! I swear to God, you're going to be sorry if you don't give it back now! You hear me? Give it back!" Eddie screamed out in delirium. The older boys laughed antagonistically at Eddie as they spread out in different areas of the hallway. The older boys then began to play keep away with his, quote, magic glove. Eddie became progressively more hysterical as his attempts to recover the glove became increasingly more futile. "Give it back! Give it back! You freaking jerks! Give it back!" Eddie sobbed in an incredibly high-pitched voice. The more he cried, the greater the pleasure the older boys experienced. A high school administrator heard the commotion and turned the hallway corner to investigate. He saw Eddie on the floor, sobbing incoherently as the older boys threw his mitt back and forth while evilly laughing at him. "Break it up! What happened here?" the administrator inquired. The older boys stopped tossing the mitt back and forth, and Bobby Jones put on a straight face and professed, "It was a joke, Mr. Kirstein. Me and the guys took Linus's glove to break his balls. I just wanted to see his reaction." Bobby Jones took the mitt and threw it down on the hallway floor next to Eddie and burst out laughing with orgasmic delight. The other boys followed his lead. "That was awfully cruel of you fellas. You boys should be ashamed of yourselves for tormenting this child," stated the administrator sympathetically. "Are you all right? Come on now, straighten up. It's okay. It's over now. Your glove is right there next to you." Eddie stopped whining long enough to snatch up his, quote, magic glove. He then dried his eyes and got back onto his feet again. He didn't utter another word, another sound. He just walked over to the memo, posted on the wall, and began to read it. The memo read, "All boys who are interested in playing varsity baseball should report this Friday to the gymnasium at 2 p.m. for tryouts. Sincerely, Skip O'Neill, Coach." "See you assholes on Friday!" Eddie yelled at the older boys as he stormed away down the hallway. The administrator gave Eddie an astonished look and shook his head in disbelief. The other boys just snickered at his remark and disbanded. Next chapter. Chapter's called Second Thoughts. It was a long wait for the late school bus, but Eddie was used to it. Since his arrival in high school, he never rode the regular bus home. The late bus became a sort of safe haven for him, a retreat from the ridicule he experienced throughout the school day. Very few people rode the later buses, and because of this, he felt assured that any derogatory comments would be few and far between. Eddie learned to believe the old adage, "There is beauty in numbers." This belief was reinforced by the fact that many of his daily hecklers, when riding alone on the late bus, were far less brave with their comments, especially since their friends were not around to back them up. From day one in high school, Eddie had received very shabby treatment indeed. His reputation from his middle school days had preceded him. Back then, he was big enough to fight his battles, but in high school it was a totally different story. He was nowhere near big enough nor strong enough to tangle with the tall, muscular older boys who inhabited the high school. In Eddie's eyes, those were the only kind of boys that ever started trouble with him. At times he had feelings of deep regret for the way he treated others during his middle school days, because now his pugnacious behavior was coming back to haunt him. To him, every mean deed he committed in the past seemed to be repaid threefold. The upperclassmen seemed to focus in on him as their new public enemy number one. Losing his patience, he stared out yonder to see whether he could spot the late bus making its approach, but it was nowhere in sight. His mind was in torment when he thought about the details of that game of keep-away. The thought of them taking his, quote, magic glove infuriated him to such an extreme degree that it's hard to explain in words. He kept trying to understand why he had been victimized and thought, why couldn't they just have left me alone? I wasn't hurting them. All I wanted was to see the memo on the wall. Was that too much to ask? He came to the conclusion that obviously it was, since they were compelled to mess with him in his magic glove. It seemed like everyone was always trying to mess with him in his magic glove. Thinking about his ordeal caused Eddie to lose his composure, and he stomped his foot on the pavement angrily. The loud stomp disturbed the tranquility of the moment, and the few other late bus riders gathered looked over toward him curiously. He pretended not to notice their stares by focusing his attention upon a stain that had appeared on one of his sneakers. To Eddie, the most nerve-wracking upcoming event was the varsity baseball tryouts. He knew that he hadn't matured enough physically to be a star on the varsity team yet. He also questioned whether he could hit the kind of pitching that he'd have to face as a varsity baseball player. Thoughts of Sandy Roberts and that 90-mile-per-hour fastball filled his mind. He questioned whether he was physically able to compete at such an advanced level. The late bus made its way up the school road toward the bus stop. It turned into the turnaround and came to a screeching halt. A small group of students gathered in single file next to the entrance to the bus, waiting patiently for the door to swing open so they could board. The students who boarded with Eddie were composed of kids who stayed after school for extracurricular activities and those who had been forced to serve out disciplinary detentions. Eddie enjoyed their company because, for the most part, they minded their own business. Eddie climbed up the stairs and made his way to his usual semi-private niche in the back of the bus. He sat down on the hard plastic seat and stared out the little adjustable window. His mind and thoughts wandered as he mulled over how he was going to deal with all the adversity that was being thrown his way. He pondered the question of how he was going to play baseball alongside his tormentors. He thought reconciliation with his new high school teammates would not be out of the question. He recalled how well he used to get along with all his Little League teammates before he discovered his magic glove. Maybe he could dig deep down inside and find that part of his personality, the part that everyone used to love. If it was there before, he reasoned, then it must still be there. He concluded that some soul-searching was in order. End of chapter. And of course, you know this is the Bedtime with Cousin Vinny series exclusively on YouTube. Next chapter, called A Rebellion in Heaven. With soul-searching on his mind, Eddie went to sleep that night. For years now, sleep was number one with him because he felt it was the only time he got to spend among friends. But unlike most boys his age, these dream friends were not of the feminine persuasion. No, Eddie never dreamt about girls or future sexual conquests. Instead, he dreamed of his coach. Eddie loved his dream coach more than anybody in the world. The young infielder filled his nights with the promise of a terrific future. The two established a bond that few will ever experience. Any problems in life that he came across could easily be discussed openly with his only trusted friend, the dream coach. Because of their relationship, every sleeping moment was eagerly anticipated. Eddie often debated with himself whether there was anything in the world that he wouldn't do for his best friend. So far, he couldn't think of anything. Routinely, he would find himself at the old deserted ballpark with his coach shortly after laying his head down on his pillow. This night was much different, though. The anxiety of the incident at school and the upcoming tryouts made him much too restless to fall asleep, hence delaying his arrival. Eventually, Eddie passed out and found himself wandering down the baseline toward the young infielder, who was nervously biting his nails by the dugout. He was dressed as he always was, in his old-fashioned Chicago White Sox uniform, with those unique green patent leather baseball cleats. "Eddie, my boy! It's so good to see you. You had me a little worried, kid. For a while there, I didn't think you were going to show up tonight," the Dream coach said with what seemed like the weight of the world lifted off his shoulders. He joyously ran up the baseline to greet his charge with a big hug. "I'd have been here a lot earlier, but I just couldn't fall asleep." "Yeah, I know about restless nights, Eddie. When I used to play, I could hardly sleep a wink." The man in black started to stir in the dugout, and the Dream coach immediately became aware of his presence. "Coach,